Hi, and welcome to the Right to Remain Silent podcast. I'm Jim Weber, your host and guide through actual accounts of intriguing and fascinating true crime stories as told by the law enforcement professional that experienced the event. The Right to Remain Silent podcast makes no exaggeration of fact, doesn't glamorize details, or sensationalize reality. The format here is basic. Real stories from real cops. Lastly, please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Doing this will help me continue to provide you, the listener, with captivating and relevant true crime stories. Now, let's listen in on today's episode. Hi, I'm Jim Weber, host of the Right to Remain Silent podcast. And today we are going to delve into the world of outlaw motorcycle gangs, also known as OMGs. We're going to explore their nature and operations, what they are, how they operate, what activities they're involved in. Our guest, I'm thrilled to say, is Kerrie Droban, an expert in this area. She's written a number of books and appeared on A&E as a consultant or expert pertaining to these types of gangs. Good morning, Kerrie. I appreciate you being here.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I think what I'd like to do is just kind of read your bio briefly here so listeners are familiar with who you are, your background, and what you're basing our conversation off today. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. Kerrie Droban is an award-winning true crime author, podcaster, and attorney. She writes about violent subcultures, undercover lives, outlaw motorcycle gangs, and criminal pathology. She has appeared on numerous television documentaries and shows, including A&E's Secrets of the Hells Angels, History's Gangland, and Gangland Chronicles, Vice, Investigation ID, Netflix, and 2020. Her book, Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, became the television series Gangland Undercover. So I think Kerrie knows what she's talking about here when we're discussing outlaw motorcycle gangs. Let's just go ahead and roll up our sleeves and get into this. And I think maybe what I'd like to start out is not everybody is familiar with what an outlaw motorcycle gang is. I think there's a lot of misconception. Somebody thinks they see an individual on a Harley Davidson, they're automatically a biker, bad guy, one percenter. And that's not necessarily the case. Could you just kind of tell us what an outlaw motorcycle gang is, Kerrie?
Sure. And it's important to note the distinction. I think that outlaw motorcycle gangs often call themselves outlaw motorcycle clubs. And they do that for a very strategic reason because they want to be lumped in with the average motorcycle enthusiast. They have this, they've perpetuated this myth that they are just a group of people riding high, living free, and riding around in their Harleys. And that's not the case at all. So OMGs are actually organized criminals. They're an organized gang. They have a code of conduct, a secret language. They have patches or club colors, which identify them with particular clubs. But most specifically, they are known as one percenters. And the reason that phrase came about was the American Motorcycle Association coined that one percenter term because outlaw motorcycle gangs are the 1% of motorcycle enthusiasts who commit 99% of the crimes. So you have, they're not the rich urban professionals riding around with their leather and Harleys. They are out there committing organized crime. And so to sort of boil that down even further, there are certain gangs known as the Big Five. And so they are, I mean, everybody's familiar probably with the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Mongols, the Bandidos, and the Pagans. And so what really kind of sets them apart from regular motorcycle enthusiasts is that they are very interested in acquiring territory. And so each one of these gangs has national chapters in certain territories. For example, I use the Hells Angels. Hells Angels territorially are situated on the West Coast. You have the Outlaws territorially situated on the East Coast, but they're all vying for certain territory. And so they have, each of them just sort of generally have chapters in almost every state in the United States and internationally worldwide. So that's why they're so important, really, to understand what they are and who they are.
Sure. That's a great explanation of what they are. And in that you mentioned chapters. You and I know what a chapter is. Could you just briefly explain what that is to listeners?
So each one of these gangs sets themselves up as a chapter, and a chapter has a president, a vice president, a sergeant at arms, maybe a road captain, a treasurer, secretary. So they have these different roles, and within that chapter, they have a certain structure. And so this is how they sort of set themselves up as a club, which is they have bylaws, a constitution, a code of conduct. They have a membership requirement. They have club dues that everybody has, who's a member has to pay into. But really, what all of these dues are helping them sort of acquire or have a cachet or a defense fund in case these individuals wind up incarcerated or arrested for their various criminal exploits. So that's how they're structurally set up. And what makes them interesting, and I'll speak specifically about the Hells Angels, since they are the gold standard of the outlaw motorcycle world. Everybody sort of aspires and wants to be like them. So what the Hells Angels did is they don't have a national president or an international president. They are one among equals, is how they sort of tout themselves. So they set up these specific chapters so that each one of those presidents can control and make sure their members are kind of following the rules, but they don't report to a national person. And the reason that's significant, and maybe you'll get into this later, is they don't want any of the criminal exploits that their members are doing to come back to the club itself. And that's important for law enforcement purposes. It makes them very difficult to infiltrate. And so that's sort of why they're structurally set up like that.
Okay, that makes complete sense. And that's a great point. Something that I was going to mention earlier was, I believe in one of the programs you were on concerning the Hells Angels, there was a chapter president named, I think it's George Christie. And he said something, and this isn't an exact quote, but something along the lines of the Hells Angels is not a criminal organization. It's an organization that has some criminals within it. I think that's a misnomer that they put out there to the general public. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's completely ridiculous. It's,
Yeah,
I mean, this is the euphemism is, so if they want to call themselves a motorcycle club, really the euphemism is it's a murder club. I mean, it's a club of criminals. They are organized criminals. And I should back up a little bit. I mean, they started out very early on, and again, I'll use the Hells Angels as an example, but they started out as a renegade sort of rebels without a cause when they first formed in the late, post World War II. They first formed in California. They rode around on their motorcycles. It was a attractive to vets that were coming, out of the war. And they wanted to sort of perpetuate that same brotherhood, that same sort of, let's all get together and have this camaraderie. And they began in the countercultural revolution. And so they were this band of renegade rogue people that rode around on motorcycles, and some of them started to commit crimes. But they weren't focused and they weren't organized. And so they didn't really have a purpose. And so when Sonny Barger, who, is like the George Christie of the whole chapter,
Sure.
when he started to run the Oakland chapter, he sort of perpetuated this persona of, this is who we are, but we have to have more of an organized front. And the reason they became that way is because of the meth trade. So when meth started to become really popular in the early 70s, they began to see that not only could you be using drugs, but you could be supplying drugs and distributing drugs and manufacturing them. And meth was very easy to do that with. It's the drug of choice for the bikers. And so Sonny started to perpetuate this. He started to recruit chefs and cooks, meth cooks, and realized that he could manufacture this domestically and then export it internationally. So it became this very organized group of individuals. And so from there, they began to traffic in drugs. They began to traffic in arms and weapons. And they began to use their club as a source for these criminal exploits. So not only did they do drug trafficking and arms trafficking, but they also got involved in prostitution, in money laundering. They needed a place to put their profits, right? And they can't just be acquiring profits. So they had to actually open sort of legitimate businesses and funnel their money through legitimate businesses. And so they became involved in money laundering and extortion and gambling. And so now they're an organized group of criminals. And I should add that many of them borrowed from the mafia, right? I mean, this is exactly the structure of the mafia. And so not only did they have this sort of model that they were framing, but they also had a symbiotic relationship with the mafia, and it became a lot of the foot soldiers and the muscle for the mob. And so they really sort of worked in tandem in this whole unit. So yes, they are an organized criminal syndicate.
Sure, absolutely. And, springboarding off what you said there in preparation for today's conversation, I have a history and background, career law enforcement officer, and just doing a little bit of research prior to this morning, I dug up some old paperwork and did some searching online with the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice, DOJ, they define these guys specifically. They define these organizations specifically so law enforcement can target them. And they call them organizations. And this is exactly what you have said this entire time. DOJ defines them as organizations whose members use their motorcycle clubs as conduits for criminal enterprises. They're highly structured criminal organizations where the members engage in the criminal activities, such as you've just described here, including violent crime, weapons trafficking, drug trafficking. And I would take it a step further today. Wherever there's money to be made in criminal activity, a hot topic these days is human trafficking, human, smuggling. When I worked at the Department of Homeland Security, saw these organizations significantly involved with these types of criminal activities simply because of the money that could be made. So not only are they forging relationships with the mafia, as you say, but they're also forging relationships with Mexican drug cartels. These cartels are also smuggling significant amounts of people. So you're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. DOJ defines it that way. And I would take it a step further from the perspective of the law enforcement background I have with Homeland Security. We looked at bikers, specifically Hell's Angels, like you said, the big five, Mongols, pagans, outlaws, etc., as transnational criminal gangs and criminal enterprises. And for an organization to be a transnational gang, there's a couple criteria that we looked at. Is there foreign-born membership involved in these groups? Are these individuals participating in crimes with a cross-border nexus? Well, of course they are. They're bringing drugs from point A to point B. They're bringing drug money from point B back to point A. So they're clearly doing this cross-border criminal activity. And they also communicate with individuals outside of the United States and other countries in furtherance of their criminal activity. So what you're saying is spot on. based on the experience that I had in my career. And that kind of leads me to another topic I'd like to discuss with you. And essentially why I was interested in speaking with you is, what is an expert? What is an individual? There's subject matter experts, in court. There's experts on topics. As far as our conversation here today, could you just give listeners a brief description or explanation of what you feel an outlaw motorcycle gang or club expert would be?
Sure. I mean, I think that, as you've stated, it can come from multiple areas. I mean, you could be somebody who's actually infiltrating the gangs themselves, where you're spending 18 months or more inside and learning about their activities and gathering intelligence for law enforcement to then do prosecute. Or you're somebody like me who, I've written, 5 books on this. I've studied this, I've researched it, I've investigated, I've done the interviews, I've done, in a lot of ways, have sort of been in the trenches, not infiltrating the gangs, but certainly speaking to, informants who have been inside, who have risked their lives for this. And so I think that does qualify me to know a lot about how these gangs are structured, how they operate, how they gather intelligence, how insidious they are, and to make it part of the same mission that I think law enforcement has, which is to expose them, to tell people about who these people are, because they really do, in a lot of ways, fly under the radar. And I think that's very dangerous. And I think that they give an impression to a lot of the public that they are misunderstood misfits, which is not the case at all. And so I
Correct.
think, part of my role as an expert in this is to educate and is to inform and to expose, these criminal syndicates for what they are and for how dangerous they are. And I think that a lot of that can be, an expert can be sort of doing it from, their armchair, basically, like the quarterback. But, for myself, I think I've really sort of been in the trenches with a lot of the individuals involved in the infiltrations and those who were I guess the people arrested from the infiltration. So it's been interesting. I've been on both sides.
Sure, absolutely. I would agree wholeheartedly in your instance. Not only are you researching, you're interviewing law enforcement officers, you're interviewing and speaking with defendants, you're interviewing and speaking with individuals that are or were members, also confidential informants, as referenced in your book. So I would say that you're almost like a step above in that expert world, because not only are you doing all that research, you're dealing with the individuals themselves. So um, we're just fortunate to have you here today to share your knowledge about this type of thing. Before we get into specific crimes that these individuals are involved in, let's talk a little bit more about the fascination by the general public with these guys. I think, let's talk about where it originates. Where does it come from? Me personally, I think there's just this perceived mystique about how cool it is, how cool they look, how cool they sound. You see 10, 20, 50 guys riding a pack through your town, you hear that. It can be overwhelming and attention getting. And, the joke here in this region here in the Midwest, and I think it's fairly common around the world actually, is that they're just guys on bikes doing fundraisers and charity events and poker runs to generate money for the misfortunate and the poor. And that's not the case. But I think in some cases, the general public, through no fault of their own, is just kind of duped into believing that. And I think what adds to that mystique are these television shows and sometimes movies, television shows such as, I think the classic one is Sons of Anarchy. Sure, that's an interesting program. But when you boil it down, they're murdering innocent people and dealing poison, drugs on the street and violently assaulting people, and members are dying and they're killing members, and every law enforcement officer in that program is corrupt, and it just kind of perpetuates this misnomer or misunderstanding. What are your thoughts on that, TV shows and movies, and that misconception?
Yeah, I completely agree, and it frustrates me to no end because I think they have perpetuated this sort of they've romanticized it, I should say. I mean, biker gangs, in my opinion, are very much like the cowboys or the Wild West. They're portrayed as these sort of renegade, freedom loving, wild bunch, but harmless, right? And they put themselves out there. It's interesting. They have sort of a double persona because they want to fly under the radar. I mean, they don't want to be targeted by law enforcement. They want to be known, and if they corral themselves, with the public as these, exactly what you stated. Oh, we contribute to charities. We show up at Toys for Tots. We're just misunderstood misfits. I mean, it's all complete nonsense. I mean, they are incredibly dangerous individuals, and I think what is even more dangerous sometimes is the way they're portrayed on television and in the media as sort of these glamorous, romanticized renegades that, like old westerns. I mean, that's sort of how we look at them, like they're just part of old westerns, so part of that mystique and that myth. And and I think what frustrates me is that they they're they're glamorizing the violence. I mean, it's easy for somebody, and it kind of reminds me in a lot of ways of like you go to a horror film and you're sitting in the movie theater, and you can, it's sort of entertaining, right? You're sitting in the movie theater, it's never going to happen to you. The monster is always on the screen, and so you can walk out of the movie theater and go on with your life. And so it's never really real for the people that are watching it. And so shows like Sons of Anarchy, the Mayans that followed afterwards, they're just they're glamorizing something that is not glamorous. And now, most recently, the bike riders, that's come out, that's supposed to be based on the true story of, the outlaws. And it's frustrating to no end. And I don't know if Hollywood is just afraid to dip into the reality of who these gangs are, because that would be very helpful, I think, for people to
Sure,
understand,
absolutely.
relate to that. And it's certainly not, beyond what they've done in other cases, showing the mafia that way. So I think there are any number of fascinating cases, and I think of Donnie Brasco is one of my favorite films because I think it shows, a real infiltration into the mob. It's a true story. You have Serpico follows afterwards. I mean, if Hollywood would simply take, an undercover investigation, infiltration, a real one, and make that into a film, that would be amazing. Then people might actually, start to
Right.
be informed and educated. So I don't know why they don't do it. It's incredibly frustrating to me. And and part of me thinks that maybe Hollywood is a little bit afraid to rub shoulders with some of these bikers because, they're so, I mean, we haven't touched on this too much yet, but bikers will kill for that patch. And so a common citizen cannot put on a leather vest with a patch of like a Hell's Angel patch on the back. And a patch it's a three-piece patch that identifies who the member is. So Hell's Angel, for example, will wear the death head on their leather vest, or leather cut, I should say. And so if somebody else, if a common citizen, maybe even an actor puts on that vest, those are reasons to put out a hit on somebody. So I think there are probably those concerns and those reasons and why Sons of Anarchy evolved, why the Mayans evolved, because they don't have to use real gangs. So those are my
Sure.
opinion.
Sure. No, I would agree. That makes complete sense to me. And, and just touching on this a little bit more without beating a dead horse on my end, this goes all the way back to the 50s and 60s where they're writing these books. And I love the word you use, romanticizing this lifestyle and behavior. I think The Wild One with Marlon Brando back in the 50s, I think earlier mid 50s. And it seems like throughout the decades, there's been a significant book or movie that, like we said, perpetuates that glamorization of these guys. I remember as being a young officer towards the beginning of my career, and there were a couple movies that came out, Beyond the Law with Charlie Sheen, where he was an undercover biker. There was another one in the early 90s, a guy named Brian Bosworth, who was a pro football player. He was in a biker movie called Stone Cold. And these, in my opinion, these shows just glamorize that behavior. And then the last thing I'll say about that, and we'll move on, is was it Hunter S. Thompson that wrote a book about the Hells Angels? So there, and then influential figures like the names you mentioned earlier, Sonny Barger. I don't think we've mentioned this one yet. Chuck Zito, who has ties to Hollywood. These guys put out books and are glamorized on social media. So it's just this vicious circle of promoting these guys. But I think from here we should kind of step into what you just mentioned, the violence or the crimes. You said these guys will kill, it, and they'll kill at the drop of a hat for something related to their club. Let's talk about that a little bit. Their behavior like that. Could you kind of just explain or describe the overall mindset of these one percenters when it comes to this type of crime?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the mindset, I mean, you have to realize that their sole purpose, their sole reason for existing is to acquire territory and to get rid of their rival gang. Okay. And I'll use the Mongols and the Hells Angels as a prime example. So they acquired or lived or occupied the same territory. They both occupied California. Okay. And so they couldn't coexist in California originally. And so
Right.
they really got involved in gang warfare for several years until finally a truce was had between the two of them, between the two gangs, because they didn't want to bring law enforcement down on both of them. And law enforcement was very interested in stopping this because they were committing a lot of violent crimes. While they're trying to acquire territory, while they're trying to snuff out their enemy, they're also committing murders, assaults, rapes, as you mentioned, drug trafficking, smuggling, prostitution, anything they can to further the interests of their club. Now, the catch to this is they can't have any of these activities actually come back to the club. These have to be,
Right.
because that would be RICO, right? And that would be a problem. And RICO, just for your listeners, is racketeering influenced corrupt organizations. That's really what the heart and soul of law enforcement has been trying to get a lot of these gangs on. And the whole impetus behind RICO is if they can prove that these criminal acts are being directed and by the organization itself, right? They are a criminal enterprise that is at the helm of these. That's how they get a lot of these gangs. That's how they got the mafia. So it's really, really significant. So that's, the undercurrent of this. But the violence that is done is, I mean, it stems from everyday violence to putting out contract hits on people's lives. And they will do that to make sure, number one, that their rival is snuffed out. Number two, that their patches, their colors, I mean, there's any number of names that they call these things, but they're basically what identifies each gang with their particular club. And as I mentioned, the Hells Angels with the death head, each club has their own. And so the whole reason for these members to become what we would call made members is to acquire that coveted patch. Because once they have that patch, they are in, and they're in supposedly for life. And so that gives them the, I guess, the stamp of approval from not only the gang, but also the reason for them to acquire and go after other people that threaten that patch, that threaten that identity. So it's really hard, I think, for people to understand this kind of mentality that is, kill or be killed. It's, we're going to acquire as much territory as we can and we're going to kill whoever we need to get that territory. And that's really boiled down to its, very base level, is that they are in a lot of terms. And I think a lot of the people who have left the club, and they don't call it excommunication because that's, a church phrase. They call it out bad or in bad standing. Those who have left have been very disillusioned by what the club actually is, that it's not this band of brothers, coming together. There's not this camaraderie. There's this undercurrent of killing, where we're going to kill for this. We're going to maintain our image at all costs, at whatever the sacrifice.
Yeah. Yep. That makes complete sense. That's a good explanation there. As you're talking, my mind kind of transitioned to the way these guys, the way we're describing them is, it's just not, they're just not great guys, right? And there are women that hang out and socialize and run with these organizations, girlfriends, um, for lack of a better term, like groupie type of women, wives, girlfriends, and women that just hang around and enjoy that lifestyle. But when you peel back the layers here and really analyze what we're talking about here, about how these guys operate and behave, they're racist, misogynist, prejudiced, very disrespectful to women. I'd like to just briefly touch on, why do you think that women, and this is a male dominated world of bikers, why do you think women are drawn to that? And why do you think they stay there even though they're treated the way they are treated, disrespectful?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, and it's fascinating. I mean, it's not lost on people that I'm probably maybe the only woman that has been writing about biker clubs and investigating them and researching them. And I think what I have learned from my interviews with many of the women in these clubs is interesting. So the women, as you mentioned, are really sort of second class citizens. They are actually considered below dogs in the biker culture. I mean, the bikers actually have a code of conduct, which is club first, bike second, God, country, dog, women. Okay, so women are way down there. They're not even like real people in that world.
Right.
And I should mention, a lot of the women are used to commit the criminal acts. So they are the mules, they are the drug traffickers, they are the people that hold the weapons for their old men, their bikers. They're called
Right.
old, like old men.
Right.
But anyway, they're the ones that are also put in positions like in law enforcement, or they work as dispatchers. They're gathering intelligence for the club. So it is really mystifying to me on a lot of levels why these women would do this, because when they rise in the ranks, and there is a rank for women, they start out as pass arounds. These are the women that are raped, even though a lot of the women I interviewed incredibly have said they're not raped, that they volunteer for this, which is kind of mystifying, but they're passed around. They are property of. They actually wear a shirt that says property of, and it's considered a badge of honor to be the property of somebody, right? A member who is going to, and what they've told me is they feel protected, which is really sort of a bastardized version of everything. They feel
Right.
protected. One of the women that I interviewed, and she's written about in The Last Chicago Boss, which was about the godfather of the Chicago Outlaws. She was married to the godfather, Big Pete, and she told me that it was a place where she felt the most comfortable because she knew what was expected of her. She knew the roles. She knew the code of conduct for women. Like, there wasn't any confusion. And she worked in the IT world, which is just mystifying to me. I mean, she had a college degree, a master's degree, but she also had this double life. So that's one level. Then there are the women who are the lawyers, the bankers, the people that just are intrigued by this sort of really warped and wrong romantic view of who these people are. And so they will go to the clubhouses and, socialize with the members and be able to say after they leave that, I spent the night with a Hell's Angel or
Yeah, yeah. If I
they,
could interrupt really quickly there, I apologize, but great example is, I worked these types of investigations as well, and we had certain 1% clubs in the region here in the Midwest where I am, and they would have almost like an open house at some of their clubhouses where they would extend an invitation to the general public, charge them $20 a head to come through that door, and then charge them exorbitant amounts for alcohol. And these general John Q. citizen can walk around and hobnob and rub elbows with gangsters and criminals, all the while these folks are making money off them. So that's just an example of exactly what you're saying there is how they will operate sometimes. So I apologize for interrupting, but you just
yeah.
made me think of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it really stems from the naivete of the public. I mean, the women, and I'll speak from the women's perspective, women that feel like they can come in and just have a night of, hanging out with a real wild person, I mean, a
Right.
real
A
criminal.
real
And
bad boy.
yeah, a bad boy, and then be able to, leave it and go back to their world that's very stated. It's in a lot of ways. I mean, I use this analogy a lot, but it's sort of like Fight Club. They can go in and do this very sort of underworld thing, and then go back to their world, and nobody talks about it. And that's one level, and then you've got the hierarchy of women where women become they even get married in this club. I mean, it's really sort of a weird bastardized version of traditional they try to take the traditional stuff like marriage and make it their own, so like it's confusing and strange, but for a group of self-professed nonconformists, they are probably the most conforming gang out there. I mean, they live and breathe by a set of rules and rank. And, God forbid somebody goes beyond or above, somebody else to do something without getting, the orders to do it. So it's really, that to me is what is fascinating about it, how they borrow from a lot of these, great organizations, like the military. I mean, a lot of the people that originally joined the Hells Angels were vets coming out of World War II. But now what is striking to me, and I'm sure you have found this too, is that there is active and retired military that are in these gangs, which is really sort of like blows my mind that they're still in there. But a lot of that is the attraction of this similar rank and file structure. So they're coming into that, coming from a world that they understand and know, and the sense of belonging, which I think women also have that. They want that sort of structure and sense of belonging. They get into this group and then they find out, it's actually not, it's not a good group to be a part of,
Right. Right. Yeah. And I can't recall which, it was a Hell's Angel that said this recently, or I saw it recently on a program. They said, men want to be us and women want to be with us, and that's really what you're saying here. That's the mentality. And absolutely, going back to what you said about the military, again, in my experience as a federal agent, investigating some of these guys and organizations, I personally saw military members residing on military bases, or they were a spouse of a military member living on a base. Um, and they're a full patch 1% gang member. That was mind blowing to me. There was an incident, and I'm not going to say specifically who or exactly where, but there was a lieutenant colonel in the Army that got hooked up with one of these legitimate big five 1% clubs here in the Midwest and ran with them for quite some time. And that was mind blowing. But I think it goes back to what you said is they're out in battle, they're adrenaline rushing, they're flying in planes and helicopters and living that fast lifestyle in the military. They come home and it's kind of humdrum, so they're looking for something exciting to associate with. So it's just to you and I, it's just mind-boggling, I think.
Yeah.
Why, when you peel the layers back and you look at what these groups and people are, that they're so uh, looked upon by the public in a positive light, which is just shocking.
Yeah.
Um, it's something that I want to go back on here a little bit is you mentioned structure and membership and the different levels within these OMGs. You know, there's membership and then there's officers. You mentioned the officers, but you have it. Do you want to mention briefly the different levels of membership, like starting with a hang around and how it kind of progresses up into full patch?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so, I think part of the allure, as we've talked about, is this idea of, it attracts a lot of people that want a sense of brotherhood. They want a sense of, camaraderie. And so it's sort of like a criminal fraternity in a lot of ways. But so people will start. So just as a fraternity will have pledges, a club or, a gang will have hangarounds. So hangarounds are people that just sort of, they're allowed to be there, sort of observing and deciding whether or not they want to commit, because it is a commitment to be in the club. It's like a 24/7 commitment. So once they're hanging around, then they get somebody who might be interested in sponsoring them. And, by sponsoring them, then they become a prospect or a probate, depending on what gang you're pledging to. And a prospect or probate is somebody who has a sponsor who's going to kind of show them the ropes, maybe, vet them a little bit, find out whether or not, again, they have that sort of same commitment to the club, whether they're going to be loyal. And then once they probate for a while, and there's no particular time frame, it can be as long as it takes, right? Then a sponsor will start vouching for them and saying, this person should become a member, and they become a, what we understand as a made member. And so there are definitely levels there where they have to prove themselves, and they prove themselves through a number of things. I mean, there are a number of tests that they have to go through, some of which is drugs, some of which is women, some of which is murder. What are they willing to do for the club and on behalf of the club in order to show their loyalty? And that is, when I say it's a commitment, it's a 24/7 commitment. I mean, when they join, they're expected to be available for mandatory runs, which are bike runs, which is, they can go to sometimes 100 bikes at a time, riding single file or two abreast, on the highway. They're going to a run, which, is a euphemism for a party, a gathering, some kind of
Right.
meeting, or they are committing to monthly church meetings. The gangs, again, have euphemisms. They call their meetings church meetings. All of these coded languages and coded messages are all ways for them to stay under the radar, to appear like something that they're not. But eventually, when these members become made members, they're in it, and they are, pledging to their fellow members that it's, one for all for one. They're, so that's what makes it so difficult on a lot of levels for law enforcement to infiltrate them. That's what they try to make themselves impenetrable that way, because it's very difficult to you can't just show up, to a
Hey, I'm here to
gang
be a gang
meeting.
member. Sign me up. Right.
Right. I mean, there's all kinds of tests they have to pass, and, vetting, they do background checks. I mean, obviously, law enforcement has gotten very savvy over the years and has been able to, infiltrate several of these gangs and acquire intelligence. But not only do they have their members, but as I mentioned, they have their foot soldiers. Their foot soldiers are the women sometimes, sometimes they do prospects or hangarounds that will go and be their drug mules. They'll go into other positions. I mean, a lot of times the women are the ones that actually have the jobs that funnel the money into the club, so their salaries are going into the club. And
Sure.
so it just makes it really difficult. I mean, they can they are, for all intents and purposes, a very tight-knit organization. They do not rat each other out. If they're prosecuted, it's very difficult to prosecute them because they won't testify against each other. Oftentimes judges are paid off. I mean, it's a whole network that they're committing to. And, you know,
Yeah,
it's
and like we said in the beginning, they are very complex criminal enterprises or criminal organizations going to what you just said there. Um, this is something that I mention when I'm talking with other police officers that are, currently working the road or conducting investigations that aren't familiar with bikers or OMGs, is look at what they're wearing, and compare it to this. You're a police officer and you wear a uniform, and on that uniform you have patches, and those patches say California Highway Patrol, Sergeant Stripes, the name, your ranking and your position. It's a specific color. So I use with police officers the analogy. It's the same thing almost when you're encountering these folks and dealing with them. And the reason I mention this here is for a knowledge base for the general public. If you're out there, you're listening to this episode and you're out there and you encounter what you think are some bikers that are 1% bikers, in a safe capacity, if you can observe what those patches say and what colors they are, it's essentially a roadmap telling you exactly who they are and where they're from.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and they acquire patches, and that's the really crazy part. It's sort of a bastardized version of scouts, of like people that are acquiring these patches, but they're not for great accomplishments. They're for nefarious accomplishments. They're for things, they if they kill somebody, they'll have lightning bolts on them if they're an outlaw, if they so they have all kinds of monikers and slogans, and particularly the 1% diamond patch on
Sure.
their cuts that are going to identify them for all of their criminal deeds.
Yeah, those patches, and it's also a safety issue for the general public and for police. What you just said there, those patches that indicate, hey, I've killed or I've seriously assaulted somebody, those patches will typically indicate the criminal activities or the immoral behaviors that they've exhibited to earn those patches. Um, in talking about, I think as we kind of transition towards a conclusion here, um, law enforcement continues to work to pursue these guys, to identify them, to investigate the crimes they're involved in. And there are folks out there that have been members and then for lack of a better term, they've seen the light perhaps, and they transition out of those clubs, or they're in the criminal world and they see those bikers for who they truly are, and they realize they're not good people and they try to do something about it. And I think a good example of that would be your book with Mr. Falco and what he did. Did you want to touch on that a little bit about, I don't expect you to get down and deep into every single detail, but maybe just a general synopsis or an explanation of what that individual did pertaining to outlaw motorcycle gangs.
Yeah, so Charles Falco, in the book Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, um, infiltrated three biker gangs, and he did it. He came on the heels where he was working off charges originally, and he didn't really have a lot of experience at all when he started out, but he really wanted to do something good with his life. And so he started to infiltrate the Vagos, and the Vagos is a largely Hispanic gang. And Charlie is, a very towering, white, very noticeable, identifiable guy. So for him to have infiltrated the Vagos initially, and then the Mongols, and then the Outlaws is just impressive beyond words. And he has become probably the most renowned informant out there. I think he's one of three government informants who have ever done this. And he really turned his life around. And by doing that, he not only um, you know, brought down probably one of the most successful criminal investigations or outlaw investigations out there, Operation Black Rain, which
Mm.
to kind of to your point of like how does law enforcement do this? How do we stop these gangs? Well, there's two ways to do it. One is educating the public and educating them through these kinds of infiltrations and investigations. So Charlie's work in Boggles, Mongols, and Outlaws was instrumental in bringing down some of these gangs. And so he is, incredible, impressive work in that and risked his life for that and has a number of repercussions as a result of that. So I think, credit to him for doing that and for giving us the information that we have. But one of the things that came out of that investigation was being able to hit the gang where it really hurts them. And that is that they were able to take the patches away from the Mongols. And so if you can confiscate their patches or their paraphernalia or the things that they would kill for, right? This is the thing that identifies them to their gang, the thing that they sacrifice everything
That
for.
is their lifeblood, essentially.
Lifeblood, yes. If you can cut off that supply, then I think that's golden. I mean, so that's certainly one way. The other, like, huge tool that I think really helped law enforcement was the establishment of RICO, which, the racketeering laws. So I think on the legislative level and also on the infiltration level is hugely helpful and informative for infiltrating these gangs and for exposing them and for bringing. I mean, that's really part of the what motivates me in a lot of my work. People ask me all the time, like, why do you do that? Why do you spend your life, as a woman, particularly working in a very violent subculture, and it's because I believe in the overall impact and the message behind the work that I do, because I think that it's just one other tool that I have to be able to expose people. I mean, I'm not going in and doing what law enforcement does, but I'm certainly able to highlight those accomplishments and achievements through the work that I do and bringing that intel to front row center.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree wholeheartedly. Um, I just kind of wrapping it up here. I think we could spiral down many different rabbit holes on this topic, and we could talk about influential undercover agents and specific investigations and gangs, and we're not going to do that all. As much as I would love to sit and talk about that with you forever, I think this would be a good point to kind of bring it to a conclusion here and just reemphasize the fact that these are dangerous criminal organizations. They are not positive, uplifting groups that benefit and help society. They are organizations that are self-centered and commit crime as serious as murder to further their beliefs and goals. And I am thankful that in addition to law enforcement out there, there are people like you that help with that cause in researching this serious topic and these serious organizations and sharing that information with law enforcement, because I'm going to be honest, law enforcement doesn't know everything about everything. And individuals like you that help share what they know and what they have learned help the cause and help the overall benefit of keeping society a safer place. I think that's kind of like, I guess I'm on my soapbox here, but I would like to thank you for that. I think that that's a very noble cause that have pursued and are continuing to pursue.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Let's, how about, would you like to share with the listeners, what is Kerrie doing now? What projects do you have going on? I know I've seen you multiple times on A&E, sharing your knowledge there. Could you share with us a little bit about what's going on with you right now?
Yeah, sure. I have another show coming out, and I think it's coming out August 11th, Gangland Chronicles, which is a reboot from the History's Gangland, I believe, which I was on many years ago. But Gangland Chronicles really highlights the Mongols and the Hells Angels again. Just more of the individual cases that you've talked about, and just highlighting some of the people who have left the gangs and their disillusionment, what has happened to them since, which is really fascinating. And I'm also, I would just encourage people, if they're interested in really learning about, kind of being inside on some of these infiltrations, to check out my books. They can go to my website, kerriedroban.com. They can go to Amazon. They can check out any number of, there you go, any number
There
of
you go.
podcasts that I've done on OMGs. And I also, I work on what I call the vanilla crime too, the basic true crime, because I'm passionate about that too. I just transitioned my fight for justice and my passion over exposing, a lot of these criminal exploits to what I call vanilla crime. And so I have started a podcast. It's a narrative nonfiction podcast in similar format to some of my OMG books, where I take cases, some of the cases that I have actually worked on, and I put them into a format that is really easy to listen to, but it's still continuing that sort of fight for justice, that fight for, exposing what these
Sure.
people are. So they can find that as well.
Excellent. Do you have a specific website that you would want to share where listeners could obtain your book? I know I believe I got mine through Amazon, but did you have a website you would like to mention?
Yeah, it's kerriedroban.com. And on that website, you'll also find the podcast, Crime Stands Still, and several of the shows that are being highlighted now. So
Sure, absolutely. And I showed your book there. I've become hooked on Crime Stands Still. So keep up the good work. I've been listening to that. Is there anything else that you think is relevant or you'd like to mention, reference the topic today that we maybe overlooked or missed? Or do you think we pretty much gave it a solid overall summary?
I think this is a very good introduction to the OMG world, and to hopefully sparking people's interest to maybe delve a little deeper into it. And hopefully we've shattered a few myths today, and encouraged
Exactly.
people to look into it more closely, and to really drill down into who these gangs are, why they need to be stopped. And I should mention too that, I think it's an unfortunate but a bit of a misnomer that the gangs can actually be eradicated, because they're kind of like sleeper cells. When you take the head of the snake, when you take the president out, or you take out a major gang leader, oftentimes there are people coming up right underneath them that will take over and take their place. But I will say that even in the OMG world, it does evolve and change, according to societal norms and how these gangs are, recruiting. And so I think there is ultimately hope. I think the more people that understand who they are and what they are is going to help curb, their evolution. So I hope that it's at least doing that.
Sure. Absolutely. I appreciate that. Well, I think we'll conclude for today. Perhaps in the future, we could consider revisiting this topic and getting a little bit more specific. Who knows? We'll see what happens in the future. But I'd like to thank you, Kerrie Droban, for taking the time out of your busy schedule and talking with me today, sharing your knowledge on this very interesting topic. Again, thank you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
All right. And to the listeners out there, I just want to mention, please remember to like, subscribe, follow, and share on my social media. And thank you for listening, and stay safe out there. The Right to Remain Silent podcast is brought to you by Streetwise 360 Studios. I would like to again thank today's guest for sharing the story right here on the podcast. Please remember to like, follow, share, and recommend us so that I can continue to bring you high caliber guests sharing their experiences just like we heard today. If your law enforcement agency is interested in training provided by Streetwise 360, or if you know someone that has an interesting law enforcement story to share, please contact me via the website, www.streetwise-360.com. www.streetwise-360.com.